Magdalena Abakanowitz is linked to Hesse through the use of fiber, and also I think through the shared approach to art where both artists are inserting personal feelings and very strong expressions. Abakanowitz also elevates fiber art to a level well beyond craft, to what we would count as high art. She begins her work, that's her in the center of the image, by using a mold that produces identical figures that are multiples, essentially. But the mold is actually lined with resin, and fibers are pressed into the resin so that at the end the images are sharing a common form, but the surface is very different on each of them. Somewhat separate and unique, while being linked together as multiples at the same time. For Abakanowitz, fiber was considered to be something that is a universal form that links life forms together, so that it was, excuse me, something like plant tissues that could be shared by all living creatures, so it became a very viable form of expression for her. She places her works without pedestals, we've seen this before, and in the space of the viewer, although in this case you can see larger than the viewer. You can also quite easily link Abakanowitz to Rodin in the forms that she's created, which are partial figures. Abakanowitz is also an artist who is important to us because she is an artist who is one of the Neo-Expressionists. Neo-Expressionism is a movement that begins largely, I'd say, in the 70s, but really is associated with the 80s, which is a period when it flourishes. It is created in reaction to minimalism and concept art and extraordinary rejections of imagery. It brings back imagery, and it also brings back intense emotions to works of art. The Neo-Expressionist depictions tend to be, in fact, very disturbing images, very powerful, very disturbing. It's been suggested that this movement, which is universal, it's around, essentially around the planet, it originates in Europe. It is a marker some people use to move from modernism to postmodernism. I have not yet decided if I actually agree with that, but it is one way, certainly, of looking at the powerful expression that one finds in Neo-Expressionism. Neo-Expressionism is varied. It's different in different parts of the world. The only place where there seems to be a connection is in Germany, and I think that's because of the shared heritage coming out of World War II that German artists continue to work with even today. It is a movement that also helps to fuel the art market in the 1980s. The art market was very thirsty for powerful emotional depictions, and also any depictions, things that had subject matter. Collectors were eager for the acquisition of things they could understand more readily and relate to more readily than minimalism. The general style of Neo-Expressionism is large in scale, and I think you can get a sense of that looking at Abakanowitz and some of her pieces. It's very emotionally charged. It tends to be gestural, and by gestural I mean a very rich surface, and with Abakanowitz that would imply the resin that is coated and embedded with fibers, creating almost a sense of burned flesh on the bodies that she is exhibiting. And most of all, I think meaningful content, powerful content. We look at Neo-Expressionist works and pretty immediately we know that they are saying something. We can't always identify what it is easily, but there is a powerful sense of meaning behind the depictions. These works also tend to be mythic. They tend to be almost superhuman or epic. So they're making a big statement, perhaps difficult to translate, but nevertheless inherently profound. That would be one of the best ways, I think, of looking at Neo-Expressionism. Before I forget to say it also, We, in our earlier talkies, discussed Basquiat as a neo-expressionist, so I would like to just pull that back to remind you of it so that you can be thinking of Basquiat as a member of this pretty powerful and telling group. This is the work that we have in our textbook. It is 3140 in our book, and it's backs. These have been variously displayed, as you can tell, with the top right in a museum context, variously displayed with also various numbers of backs. Again, created in the same way, mold made, so they're exactly the same, but aha, they're not, because the surface of each varies as the fibers are pressed into a resin that becomes essentially a coating on the surface. They are very disturbing to look at, but it is not easy to understand them. They do seem epic in scope and in meaning. When I first looked at these, when I first saw these, my reaction to them was that they reminded me of victims of a concentration camp or victims of torture, or perhaps even the victims of modern life, because the headless, and they are headless again, they're partial figures, headless and armless. The figures seem to bow down. What we now understand about Abakanowitz's images. She was in Poland under the period of the Nazis, and later in Poland under Soviet occupation as well, that her images have come to represent the people who listen to leaders without thinking, or perhaps without challenging authority, maybe when we should be challenging authority. In other words, to become a kind of drone, or to become a kind of robot. Or to quote the description that was used in a show I saw at Princeton. Let's look at it. Right here. These are called big figures, and they really are big figures, following the same formula that Abakanowitz has used. This was a display at Princeton University from a private collector who is putting it out for the public to look at. The figures themselves, you can see from the back, seem to be hollow, yet the figures seem to march lockstep in a threatening way, intimidating the viewer, in fact. And we understand that Abakanowitz's comment in these figures is to cause the viewer to think about, quote unquote, the mindless complicity of ordinary human beings when people attempt to control us. And of course, she's referencing things like the Nazis and their power and the spread of their power. These images then make a comment. They're highly emotional, and they, at the same time, link to past traditions such as the partial figure. Anselm Kiefer, a German neo-expressionist, is in fact one of the most powerful and perhaps most well-known of the neo-expressionists of the 20th century. He is known as a sculptor as well as a painter, but I want to focus on his large-scale landscapes because they're the pieces that have brought him to fame. But in particular, also Negrito, which we're going to look at in a moment, is located in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, so you will at some point have a chance to see that piece. It is very large in scale. It runs about 18 feet in length, so it's a big picture. Because of its size and because of the size of many modern pieces, the Philadelphia Museum of Art is in the process of expanding its exhibition space because it was finding it very, very difficult to display modern works of art for any significant length of time without having to rotate them to share the space for other large-scale modern works of art. Let's look, in fact, at Kiefer's Negrito. But before we do, he was, and I'd like you to see the date, he was born in 1945 in Germany. He was born before the end of World War II, which means that he spent his formative years dealing with the aftermath of World War II. And that does mean the collective guilt of the German people and the attempt to understand what actually took place in World War II under the direction of Adolf Hitler. And in particular, I'm referring to the Holocaust and the atrocities of the war. Anselm Kiefer's belief was that German people tended to deny the realities of the war and of the Holocaust and push them away without confronting them. His paintings tended to force people, and they're big, so if you see one, you can't avoid it, tended to force people to confront the subjects of the war. And by doing so, it was suggested that it would be possible to overcome, perhaps to improve, to get past mythically the devastation of the war and to move on to a purer state of existence, or a better awareness, at least, of history. So let's take a look. This is Negrito. Negrito is 3227 in our textbook, and it's very typical of Anselm Kiefer's works in that it is a large scale. His famous works is large scale landscape. It has a very, very high horizon with very strong perspective lines pulling us in. It shares, in fact, that those features with Vincent van Gogh's landscapes, both of which tend to make the viewer very claustrophobic and gives the sense that there really is no place to go. There's no escape from the picture, or in this case, perhaps from the message of the picture. It is a mixed media work. It has a paint, acrylic paint. It has lacquer in it. It has lead, often melted by the artist. It also has straw on the surface, and all of this is placed over a photographic image. In places, Kiefer has also charred the surface, in other words, torched it or burned it, giving us rough, uneven surfaces. Perhaps, as our textbook, Gardner in the 16th, the new edition, has just added, that references the permanent scars that exist on, well, the soul of the German people as a result of World War II. Overall, I do see Kiefer's landscapes as an attempt to suggest the need to confront the war in an attempt to deal with it, and therefore perhaps to move past it. And only through confrontation and understanding would it be possible for the Germans to do that. In this particular case, we actually have a distinct reference to that because Negrito refers to one of the stages that is a part of alchemy, the alchemical process of transformation, stemming from ideas, particularly ideas in the West in the Middle Ages, where you could take base metal, lead, and turn it into gold, something beautiful, something pure, and something infinitely more valuable. So the subject of this painting then is about transformation, which is what Kiefer would like to bring to his viewers and perhaps also to the German people. A couple more views of Negrito. This is a tough one to photograph because it's large in scale. I think I'm going to show you another one right now because, there we go, because you can see the straw sitting on the surface. The straw is one of Kiefer's prime materials, and he does use this because it decays. It will disintegrate over time, and that too suggests passage. It suggests transformation, in addition to the fact that it conveys ideas of transience and perhaps along with it melancholy. Okay, this is another one of his landscapes, 1980s. It's entitled Nuremberg, and you will see Kiefer's writing on the surface where he records Nuremberg up towards the top. You are also going to see again the very strong perspective lines pulling us in and the very intense claustrophobia with this picture because he doesn't give us much breathable space in the sky. Okay, Nuremberg is the place where the trials of Nuremberg took place after World War II. It's the city, it's the place where the examination of the crimes of the German people occurred and where war crimes were unveiled so that essentially the entire world could see this, the atrocities that occurred during the Holocaust under the rule of Adolf Hitler. Perhaps promising a little bit of a better end. This is another Kiefer. Again, it's a large-scale landscape. with very little breathable space above the horizon line. In fact, the horizon line is actually difficult to determine in this one. This is a piece also laden with a rough textural surface that was created again in the 1980s. And I believe this one was done after Kiefer actually traveled to Israel and became immersed in the stories of the Jews and in the Old Testament stories in particular. This is a story, painting that deals with the story, the departure from Egypt. That departure references the moving of people by Moses under God's command from Egypt to the Holy Land, essentially the Promised Land. The Jews had been taken into bondage. They were kept as slaves or as captives. And according to the story, they were enslaved. One of the purposes was to get them to make bricks. These bricks were often made using straw as a binder. So straw in this particular painting makes an actual reference to the story. Moses will get his people out of Egypt and take them into the desert, 40 years essentially, to travel to the Promised Land. He is in that process with his people going to create a covenant with God. The people will be spiritually transformed in this journey, which becomes a spiritual as well as a physical pilgrimage. The staff across the foreground of this composition is a reference to the shepherd's staff, essentially, that belonged to Moses as a leader of his people. Okay, because this embeds the idea of transformation, which the Exodus was, it is a painting that links well with the history of the German people and the possibility, upon coming to terms with the history of Germany, of perhaps a future transformation for the modern German country and its citizens.